Are you sitting comfortably? Then it's time to soar. This is the Riff Chord.
We're in the studio today. Looking forward to a good one. Everyone ready to soar? Get in that doorway, because here we go. And we're away. Today's a great one. I'm speaking at my public library, where they have a cool recording studio. I'm speaking with Toronto author David McPherson about his book. Enjoy it, folks. It's all good. Here we go. And we're live. Good morning, David.
Morning, Paul.
David and I are sitting. What are we sitting in, David?
Right in the Hefner studio here. It's a pretty incredible space, and what an asset to this community. I think it's just one more example of, how libraries have realized they have to change in these times when there's so many other things competing for people's time, and, it's more about a meeting space now, and they offer so much. I mean, this library is incredible in this community. I mean, they have concerts, guest speakers, they have 3D printers, and now they've opened up the studio. I mean, people can even come in here and record, an album or songs. I mean, it's a fantastic space.
Yeah, and we're using it this morning just using your library card as a library member.
Yeah.
You get access to all this equipment.
Yep.
We're sitting in a radio station style recording studio, and we're looking through the glass. Look at the, it's a full musical band studio in there.
Yeah, basically, yeah. It's all soundproofed and, filled with instruments, so you don't even have to bring your own instruments. You can come and just play, experiment, have fun. Whether you're a professional musician or just a hobbyist looking to, see what it feels like to, record some sounds.
We're going to start out speaking about your book that was released. Was it 2018 or 2019?
Actually, 2017.
It's 2017.
Yeah, it's hard to believe. It's already been 3 years. Yeah, it came out in the fall of 2017 to correspond and tie into the 70th anniversary of the Horseshoe Tavern.
Oh, that makes sense. And the dates make sense, too, because in the end, when you talk about look ahead to what could be the future, you do talk about them renewing the lease on that space, and that was 2018 you were talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so the book, everyone, is called The Legendary Horseshoe Tavern, A Complete History. Great book, David.
Thank you.
Let me tell you why it struck me as a great book. First of all, your acknowledgement and your thanks at the beginning, 2 words in Spanish. And me, who takes Spanish lessons, just intrigued by everything Spanish. I just thought it was very heartfelt and very direct, and we'll leave it to the readers to read and see what it is. I assume that because you're married to a Colombian Canadian, that was in recognition for her support.
Yeah, definitely.
And beautifully said and nicely done.
Thanks.
And I always think that's one of the magical parts about marriage is when one person starts dreaming the other person's dreams too.
Mm-hmm.
And you acknowledge that in your thanks. So well done. But one of the other reasons I really like the book is it's about a musical venue that's been a big part of Canadian music history. But it's also about other things. It's about the history of that neighborhood in Toronto, which was my neighborhood when I first moved to Toronto. I was Queen West.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, for 2001. So when you get into the book and you're talking about all those old secondhand bookshops, old clothing stores that were still there, and every year they're disappearing a little more, but it's that history. There's great characters in there. You in the early stages, you talk about a Toronto detective, someone robs a bank, he's chasing after. This is all interesting, good stuff.
Yeah.
But then as you follow the music changing over the years, it really is a look at how Canada has changed and how the music sector has changed. So what got you interested in music? Were you like the kid in Almost Famous, where you didn't go to school, you just wrote music articles, or what?
No, but at one time I felt like, wouldn't that be a dream job, long before I saw that movie. I think for me, my earliest memories of music was probably just, as a kid, our family road trips every year. We'd, pack the car and set off kind of in July, early in the morning. My dad liked to hit the road really early to get those miles on. And, I remember then it was even before we had a tape deck in the car. Had an old, tape player that he'd plug into the ashtray, and, he'd have all his, John Denver tapes and things. And we'd head off to Aspen, Colorado, where I went to a hockey school. And my dad was teaching there, and that was our kind of family vacation. But, it was during those road trips. At first, it was listening to my parents' music. And, then as I got a bit older and, I started to discover more of what I liked and started buying tapes. And often, on those road trips, I would pick some up. And, the old Sony Walkman, that was a great way to pass the time. And,
That's great.
those long car rides, because we'd be on the road, 3 days straight kind of thing. So it was either music or books, that, kept my sister and I from fighting in the back seat too much.
Yeah, that's great. So was the Horseshoe Tavern always at Queen and Spadina?
Yeah, it's that's the amazing thing about this too. It's always been in the original space where it is, the same address. It's just at one point in time it was a bit larger,
I see.
and over the years, and before it was the Horseshoe, and Jack Starr purchased the building, and it was a number of things. It had been, I think, a drugstore and a few other mercantile businesses, but that address has always been there. So when you alluded to earlier about, it's not just a story of music and, bands and in Canada and this historic landmark, it also is tied into the history of Toronto and as a cultural institution and building, and how that survived through all the changes in Toronto history and gentrification and all the other, decades that have come and gone.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You, the first part of the book, you dedicate to the Horseshoe's history as a country music venue, which is largely. And I was really interested to hear that you were describing many of the big Nashville acts. The Horseshoe was on that was their Toronto home.
Yeah, and what I've told people, that was one of the biggest. I wouldn't say surprises, but most interesting facts that I learned throughout this. I knew a little bit about it in having, heard that some of these Nashville people had played there, but I didn't realize how important it was, and in the early history, and how significant that it was really like Nashville North, and all these huge country stars of the day like Loretta Lynn and Little Jimmy Dickens and Charlie Pride, and the list goes on of people who played there, and they would come up from Nashville, and most of them would spend a week playing. There'd be lineups around the block. People would come from north, west, south of the east of the city to come in to get their country fix, and so it was pretty amazing, and it all kind of started by chance in a way.
That's fascinating. Fascinating. Do you think that's why Jack Starr named it the Horseshoe?
No, well, that's, to follow that up about the idea that it was by chance. Jack Starr himself wasn't even, he didn't love country music. I don't think he talking to his daughter, for the book, she said, there was never country music playing at home, and this wasn't something that was on his radar. But he was an astute businessman. Before he started the Horseshoe, which was kind of a real left curve for his family, because he was more in the clothing business, with a few of his brothers, and he just decided to open up this bar. He saw the opportunity. And so the way country came about, it was the same idea. There was a lot of people from the East Coast, the Maritimes, that especially during the early 50s had come to Toronto looking for work. Yeah. Yeah. And one day, the story goes, Jack was just kind of strolling through the bar as he did. He was a very visible owner, operator, and talking to his customers, and they said, "Hey, Jack, you should get some music in here." Yeah. And he said, "Okay, what kind of music?" And they said, "Country, of course, because the East Coasters love their country music." And,
sure.
And so that's basically how it happened. He saw, okay, my clientele already likes this style of music. This would be a great way to, and that's really how music started at the Horseshoe. So
that's amazing.
To go back to your original question, the name itself, I think again, his daughter says, I don't know how exactly he came up with that name. I mean, there's a few different theories. I mean, there was, I think, another place in New York that was called the Horseshoe Ballroom, or had a similar name, or the Horseshoe Club. But it could have just very well been, the old symbol of the horseshoe as luck, and
Nice.
he thought this place was going to be a new lucky venture, so he named it the Horseshoe Tavern.
And you dedicate an entire chapter to Tom Connors.
Yeah.
Came Stompin' Tom Connors. What did the horseshoe mean for Stompin' Tom's career?
Oh, I mean, it was instrumental, really, in Stompin' Tom's career. I mean, he came to Toronto, and he knew that because of the history of all these Nashville greats and even a lot of Canadian country artists that played there, he wanted to play there, right? And so he made it his mission. Every chance he got, he would go and bug Jack Starr and say, "Can you give me a chance? I want to, show you what I got," right? And it was that persistence that really, took a while, because his style was so unorthodox. His stomping and his timing was a little different. So even, the local house band it took a bit for them to get used to, who is this guy, right?
Mm-hmm.
But once he got in there and people, became aware of, the power of his music, and how he could really hold a room with his songs that really tapped into both those East Coasters, because that's where Tom was from. So he already had that built-in audience at the Horseshoe, and he spoke about regular things that people in life were experiencing, or that they knew about, things in Canadian culture, right? As we know, some of his famous songs, Bud the Spud, and all that. So basically, he got in there, and once he really hit his mark, it took a bit. I mean, it became his place, and for a while that he was packing the Horseshoe. He was doing so many nights in a row, and actually he still holds the record that I don't think will ever be broken, where he played the Horseshoe. I think it was 25 straight nights.
Wow.
So it's pretty incredible, and even he recorded a movie there.
Yeah.
Part of the movie was recorded there, Across This Land. If you check that out on YouTube, you can see clips of it and get a little taste of what the Horseshoe looked like back then. And
I'll look that up. Across This Land.
Yeah, and a live album there as well. But and there's a great story about how when Tom went to Jack Starr, and I think it was around Christmas one year, and Jack basically said that he was going to give him more nights and give him a raise, and apparently Tom just broke down and cried, because it was so emotional, and what the place meant to him, and how Jack had been so instrumental. And later on, I mean, he was presented a gold record for and there's a great picture, I believe, in the book of the two of them there with the gold record for the live album.
Beautiful. That's another thing that comes through in your chapter about on the country music side, is how much of a central location it was for the country music scene. Like the Canadian Country Music Hall of Fame would come down and award people their gold albums after their show at the Horseshoe.
Yeah, well, and the record companies like RCA Records, I mean, they had a lot of country artists, and another one of the performers that is still around, Whispering Bill Anderson. He was able to talk about, writing one of his songs in the dressing room at the Horseshoe Tavern. So it's neat little stories like that. And same thing, he was presented with his gold record there by RCA later on. So there's a lot of that history that on the countryside that it was fascinating, because it was a part of the Horseshoe that I really didn't know about.
Right. Are you a country music fan now?
Yeah, even before I wrote this book. I mean, I wouldn't say, the mainstream Nashville country. Mm-hmm. It's more, I like kind of what they talk about, Americana, roots, rock, outlaw country. That's where my tastes lean a little bit more, but I've always been pretty open. Artists like, Uncle Tupelo and Wilco and Steve Earle, people like that, a lot of the Texas songwriters that lean a little bit, more to that country side of things, but...
Yeah, that's interesting because I never was into country music. I grew up a suburban kid in the 80s, so it was never my thing. But reading your chapter in the book and, reading about the, what do you call them, the beehive hairdos
right.
and the polyester outfits, I'm kind of getting into it and how excited the people were to come downtown Toronto and go to the Horseshoe and follow the music and really get into the entertainment. I thought, well, this is pretty cool. And it does have a big following as well.
Yeah.
So that brings us through the 50s and the 60s, and then we get into the 70s. I'm going to ask you about the Garys.
Yeah.
Years ago, I heard some rock and roll station morning DJ saying, if your name is Gary or Doug, you don't need a Canadian passport. You're Canadian enough. Right?
Yeah.
So tell our listeners, who were the Garys?
Well, the Garys were a pair of promoters, Gary Topp and Gary Cormier. I mean, I believe they first got together. They had a couple clubs. It was the New Yorker in Toronto. I think there was another one called the Roxy, but basically they brought in a lot of acts, and that were not really being booked by other venues. It seemed they always had their ear to the ground of kind of what was, new and under the radar before other people became aware of it. So a lot of it was the early punk stuff. Bands like
really?
like the Ramones and artists like that. Their relationship with the Horseshoe basically came as the Horseshoe in the mid to late 70s started, as the musical tastes were changing and they were struggling a little bit. What was their identity? Who were they going to bring in? And at the time they decided, well, let's roll the dice and bring in the Garys and see what they can do. And this was when people look back on it, and I interviewed a lot of people who remember that scene, both just those that were fans and who would go to all these shows, and obviously both the Garys and musicians. Everyone thought it was a much longer period than it was, but in retrospect, and it was really only about 7-8 months in 1977. Really from March until December.
Oh, really? Okay, so it wasn't even a year.
No, not even a year that they kind of were in there. But the impact they left and the legacy was pretty amazing for the type of shows they brought in and the variety of shows and
that's amazing. And was the country side of it entirely gone, or was there a bit of an overlap?
No, by then, the country was completely gone.
Okay.
And that's where, that seemed to end in kind of the mid 70s, and that's where I said they were they started to get into some more blues and maybe a little rock and a little other genres, but they really didn't know what was working,
right,
and what what they wanted at that particular time. So the Garys came in, and as much as they're known for kind of the punk and new wave artists and bands, there's a lot of Canadian groups that they brought in, like the Stranglers and all these punk bands. They really booked a bit of everything. I mean, they even had, I think, nights that included multimedia and movies and things, and but they brought in like Jesse Winchester, who's the singer-songwriter. They had who else was I think Etta James, amazing. She came in as so beyond that it was a lot. It was the punk they got remembered for,
of course,
because especially how their whole tenure ended with a bang. With one kind of final show that got immortalized in a great movie and people remember it as the last pogo.
Sure. So then once we get into the 80s, I think a lot of bands that people will recognize the name of were starting to gig, and they passed through the Horseshoe. Are there any names that stick out in your mind as to big ones?
Oh yeah, I mean, once you got in the 80s and the Horseshoe kind of started to get a new life. They had some great owners that came in with X-Ray McRae and Kenny Sprackman and Richard Crook, and that's when the Horseshoe really kind of started to get a new lease on life, if you will. And part of that was, they had a great taste in music, and probably the one that really stands out is Blue Rodeo at this time. That,
of course,
they had gone down to New York City. Jim Cuddy and Greg Keeler didn't quite, got a little disenchanted with the music industry, and they had come back to Toronto. We're just kind of thinking, oh, maybe we'll, hang this up, but, or let's try and give it one more try. And they put together a new band, and they started playing at a number of clubs, along that Queen Street strip that was starting to become, you had OCAD, the Ontario College of Art and Design, and so it just north of there on Queen, and it suddenly that section of Queen became a really kind of artsy neighborhood where, all the bohemians and all, people, artists and writers and musicians, and, they would all hang out, and they'd go to places like the Cameron House and the Bamboo, and there was a few other venues along there that, are no longer. But yeah, the Horseshoe is one of them. Yeah. And it really was there where, after building up, starting their following at other places, the Horseshoe is where, Blue Rodeo really kind of came into its own and, became known. And so for that reason, it's, that's partly why I asked Jim Cuddy, to write the foreword, because I knew he had a real connection with the place, and it's a special place for him. And, even when they were celebrating their 70th anniversary, I mean, he came back and, did a show there, and it's pretty neat. And from there, I mean, it was a lot of, you continue throughout the 80s, and so many of the
Police?
Well, that was actually earlier. That was during the Gary's time.
Oh, was that right?
Yeah. The Police was one of those shows that the Garys put on.
Fascinating.
And that was one of those neat ideas, like where everyone says they were there, and there really was only about 12 people at this show back in 1977.
Right. Yeah.
Because again, the Garys were a little ahead of, and they had heard about this band from England, and brought them over, for this one-off show, and apparently there's only a dozen people there, over the course of the weekend. But today everyone claims they were at that show.
Of course, of course. So we get into the late 80s and the 90s, and we have some surprise gigs. No one knew about them. They just got up on the stage and played. Well, a small inner circle of people knew about it, and some of them are some big names. So I've been waiting all week to ask you this, David.
Yeah.
I've got the dates written down here. Let's see if you get them. It's from your book, so let's. So if you were in the Horseshoe on the evening of March 13th, 1989, look up at the stage. Who would you have seen there?
You would have seen one of my, favorite Canadian bands that are such a seminal group. Not all the members, but the band was basically the band, which, at the time, it did not include Levon Helm, the drummer. He was not in town, but what made this so great was that, Robbie Robertson had, after the famous Last Waltz, for those who know, was the final show of the band before they broke up, back in, it was at the Winterland Ballroom, in 1976, so that was a dozen or so more years before. But flash forward here, the Junos were in Toronto. The band were being recognized, and all the remaining members, as I said, other than Levon, were there. Robbie Robertson had decided, had kind of declined or said he wasn't coming. And that's what made this such a surprise gig, because apparently, as the story goes, he basically showed up, while they were in the middle of their set.
Yeah.
At the backstage, with his guitar slung over his shoulder, and kind of motioned to the, one of the managers, Kenny Sprackman, and, he jumped up on stage, and, Colin Linden, who's a great Canadian guitarist, musician, he's in Blackie and the Rodeo Kings. He's been a producer, worked on the show Nashville. He was part of the band that night, and he talked about what a special occasion it was, jamming alongside Robbie and just seeing the smiles, and for that one moment they were back together. And Kenny Sprackman, for his part, said that for him was a moment he'll never forget. I mean, that was one of the most special nights at the Horseshoe.
That's amazing. And that band, the band, has one of my favorite lyrics from in the song "The Wait."
Yes.
Just let me sing it in my head so I can get to it. We rolled into Nazareth, feeling about half past dead. I said, "Hey, mister, can you tell me where a man might find a bed?"
Yeah.
He just grinned and shook his hand and shook my hand. No was all he said.
Yeah.
That paints quite a picture. I always love that line.
Oh yeah, and that's why I love the band. I mean, they painted stories and pictures with their music, and that's the type of music I'm really drawn to. I love words, being a writer, and so when I look to music, often it is the stories and what these artists and songwriters are able to paint.
Right.
Exactly.
Okay, another surprise gig. September 20th, 1996. Who would you have seen on stage that night?
Yeah, that one was, another one that, again, a surprise.
Yeah.
And, it was another, famous Canadian, and it was Bryan Adams. Mm-hmm. He just happened, again, I think he was in town for something. And these type of things in the music industry, I mean, happen a lot more often than, people realize. Because often it's, it's only if you're in the know, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, it's these late night jams, right, where all of a sudden someone shows up, right? I mean, I've heard, stories where, Oasis, might have been in town playing it down at the Molson Amphitheater, right, which is now the Budweiser stage, and a couple members, showing up at the Horseshoe after their gig later that night, or, so there's a lot more of those type of things. But this one, it was pretty amazing. Bryan Adams took the stage and, played a full set, and, again, at that point in his career, he was pretty well established. Had a few, huge records behind him, and to play in a small venue like that was, and for those that were there, it was pretty special night.
And as you recount in your book, he didn't just play his own music. He played a lot. He played some Tom Cochrane stuff. He played all kinds of people's music that night.
And that's kind of the cool. Sometimes when you're in a different setting like that, you're a little more relaxed, and you do kind of like you said, you're in a flow, or you just kind of more spontaneous, and maybe play a few more covers that you might not do when you're more scripted and the big arena shows.
No, exactly. Another surprise show, September 4th, 1997. Now, I'd kind of heard about this over the years, that a very famous rock band was appearing in Toronto, and they were going to do a surprise show. But that night, it was true that a small inner circle of people working at the Horseshoe knew about this, and on stage that night was?
The Rolling Stones. I mean, it's one of those, if you figure the Horseshoe Tavern by this point, I mean, it had really established a reputation as one of the greatest places for live music, and not just Toronto, but across Canada, North America. For all the people that had come through those doors, so it was only natural in one sense that, hey, one of the the self-proclaimed greatest rock and roll band should take that stage. But again, this was one where it really came about quickly, and even took the owners and people by surprise. Originally, they were in town rehearsing for their tour. I believe it was Bridges of Babylon tour, and they were going to be on a live feed for the MTV Music Awards to present an award. But then that slowly evolved. We're here. Let's put on a full show. And like you said, there was only a few in kind of the inner circle, that knew about this, and they didn't want the word to get out too much. And so it became chaos in a way to try and keep that rumor down, and also to prepare for this. I mean, to imagine they wanted to bring in all their own equipment and everything, and it was pretty crazy. But the cool part for that is that there was a singer-songwriter from Texas that was scheduled to play that evening. And, his name, of course, it escapes me now. It was Jack. It will come to me, his last name. But he arrived that night, with his band, or in the early afternoon. And basically the owners had come up to him, "Don't worry, everything's still the same. You're still going to play. There's just been a change of plans."
Yeah.
And so it ended up, he opened, the Rolling Stones opened up for him, basically, right?
That's hilarious.
So, I mean, that's a great story. He still remembered all these years later.
Yeah.
And he can, that's a bit of his claim to fame.
Yeah.
But
That's probably one of my favorite stories in the book, is recounting that night when the Rolling Stones played a surprise show. And there's a few things I like about it. Do you want to tell everyone who was tending bar that night, for a little bit anyway?
That night. Well, at the time, as I'd mentioned earlier, Kenny Sprackman, X-Ray McRae were kind of the owners, and X-Ray came from Kingston, so because of that he had the connection with Dan Aykroyd.
Exactly.
He had got to know him, well, and so Aykroyd was there apparently, and but also I think John Goodman was,
exactly.
had suddenly jumped behind the bar and was, kind of helping with, the back bar, and that was all part of the chaos. I mean.
And I love the way you tell the story in the book. You let a lot of the interviewees tell the story, and then you and it really brings it to life to hear it in those people's words. And we'll speak more about that in a moment when we get into how you wrote it. But I love this. I can't remember who it was. I guess he was an employee, and someone phoned and said, "Come to work tonight." He said, "Forget it. It's my night off." They said, No. You want to come to work now. Yeah. So he's like, something's going on there. And then he describes how he comes in the back door, turns the corner, and there's Mick Jagger sitting on a chair. Yeah. And he just tried to act as cool as possible and say, "Oh, hi, yeah, right." Right? Yeah. Oh, I guess there is something going on here. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, that was pretty neat, but that was kind of all how it all came about, right?
So then we getting into the 2000s. What kind of gigs or what type of shows was the Horseshoe putting on now?
Well, I mean, now you're getting into a time when there's, the new ownership group that is the current group that were fantastic in helping me. And I wouldn't have done this book without their support. It's Jeff Cohen, who's the principal owner, along with Craig Lasky. And, they were doing a lot of booking that I referenced earlier, a lot of those kind of alt-country bands, if you will, groups like... Whiskey Town, and other bands like the Old 97s. But along with that, it was, Canadian indie rock, a lot of other alternative acts. There was a real breadth of, music, but it really steered towards, like I said, kind of more, I'd say, indie, alternative, and alternative country, if you will.
Yeah, because like when I moved there 2001 and I used to walk by, I caught the sense that the crowds that were going in were really, well, it was what we would call hipster now. It's real indie rock, almost grunge rock. But as you say, there was all kinds of acts going on the stage there. Yeah,
and it was a little bit before that when Dave Bookman, who unfortunately passed away last year. He former DJ at CFNY. I mean, he had started this new music night previously at a bar called the Ultrasound, and started to take that to the Horseshoe, and that was a great way for up and coming bands to get a chance to play. I mean, it was basically on a night that wasn't as busy, Tuesday nights, typically at the Horseshoe, and they'd often have 4 or 5 bands in that one evening, but as part of that, sometimes because of Dave's connection, at the radio station, he was often able to bring in, again, these weren't surprise guests, but they were pretty big names that came in and played during that period, like the Foo Fighters.
Oh, wow.
Played at the Horseshoe during that time, and
that's huge.
Yeah, and Tom Yorke from Radiohead, and a few other big bands like that. So.
Fantastic. And did you do your own hanging out at the Horseshoe in your day?
A little bit. I mean, like I say in the book, I came to the venue a little later than most, probably, especially most of the people I interviewed. I only moved to Toronto after I graduated from journalism school and took my first job in kind of the late 90s. Yeah. And so that's really when I discovered the Horseshoe Tavern. It wasn't as much on my radar. I had kind of heard about it. But, when I went to Toronto to see concerts, when I was in high school, growing up in Kitchener-Waterloo and even into university, most of them were at, the bigger venues. So it was great when I, was settled in Toronto, and I loved live music. And, for me, my first experience with the Horseshoe was kind of one of those, I think it was billed as one of those new music nights in a way, or a new band. Cool. I just saw an ad in Now Magazine, and it talked about this band called the Old 97s, and they described them as country punk. And I thought, that sounds, I was really intrigued. Sure. So, I went down, and, they ended up becoming one of my favorite bands over the next, quite number of years, and, ended up interviewing them a few times. But,
fantastic.
That was kind of, my initiation, if you will, with the Horseshoe. And after that, spent, many nights there. I mean, especially during a lot of the North by Northeast music festivals in June, when they often had, full showcase nights, at different venues. I'd often, I'd look to see who was playing at the Horseshoe, and that was one of my favorite spots to, go camp out and, watch a whole bunch of bands for an evening. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, David. That has been great. The book is called The Legendary Horseshoe Tavern, A Complete History by Dave McPherson. We will put a link in the podcast. And for the second half of the podcast, David is sticking around. We're going to talk about working as a professional writer, finding gigs, finding your way, and turning your passion into a book, which all writers, I hope, aspire to do. So thank you, David.
Thanks, Paul. It's been a pleasure.
The Riff Chord Podcast.
Thank you, David. And for my listening audience, stay tuned. Do not go away. We are not letting David escape. We have the Hefner studio booked for 2 hours, so we're going to make him stick around and tell us about working as a professional writer and give a little bit of advice on that front. So stay tuned for part 2. Here we go.
You're listening to the Riff Chord Podcast.